There we go. Okay, so Chuck, if you were when you're out talking with constituents, if somebody says, gee, I kind of tend toward term limits, or why go back again? What is there that you haven't gotten done yet, or tell us a little bit about that from your experience.
Well, believe it or not, I very rarely hear at the doors people talk about term limits, especially with respect to state offices. They're more thinking of Congress people and U.S. senators. And I obviously have my own view on term limits. I've often said if you want to put a sunset on your legislators, then it's going to be the bureaucrats and lobbyists running the whole show. And I think places like Missouri have found that out, where 6 years is the tops. But but honestly, it's a question from another perspective that I've asked myself, especially in the wake of the last election, where House Democrats in Iowa had high hopes of reaching the majority. We were at 47, and we thought 51 or more was in reach, and instead we went backwards to 40. And since redistricting, we've had 16 folks either decide to retire or run for a different office. So we're back to 24 incumbents running. So assuming all of those folks, including me, get back, we'd have to elect 27 new faces to get into the majority. That's a daunting expectation. I think we have a better chance of winning the governorship, and maybe she'll have some coattails, than getting into the majority this cycle. So I've asked myself, why would I personally want to spend another 2 years in the minority? So I've been writing down some notes for myself. Given the fact that I'm at an age where I might have one career change left in me at best, do I want to ride out another term or more in the state legislature? And, there's a lot of roles that we can play, and we do play, that are really important, even when you're in the minority, that I get a lot of gratification out of doing. And I think I provide a service to the community. I think we play a convening role, getting people together by various stakeholders at the state, local, and national level to talk about common issues and to maybe move the needle on issues. We certainly play an educating role in terms of how government works and maybe how it should work. And having so many colleges and universities and public and private schools in the area, there's no lack of opportunity to play that educational role. There's the connecting role we play by identifying people who have common interests and needs but may not know each other. One of those areas, I serve on the marketing and development committee for the Lantern Center. So what's been happening in recent months with refugee resettlement in Iowa has created some opportunities for me to try to connect local organizations working in that space with, state and federal players who can maybe assist in building some greater community capacity that'll benefit Dubuque in the long run. We play a problem-solving role. This is probably the biggest area that I felt, especially since the pandemic, that I and people like me have really needed to step up our game on, whether it's access to Medicaid benefits under privatization, whether it's getting access to unemployment benefits during or pandemic aid of businesses during the public emergency, which was recently as last couple of days, small business saying, hey, the distributors aren't picking up my bottles and cans, what's going on there? Or another couple contacted me and said the Department of Revenue is telling me I have to give back my $5,000 tax credit for my solar installation. In all of those cases, sorry, I got my window open. You're hearing the traffic go by. In all of those cases, we can open some doors with state executive branch and regulatory agencies to say, hey, what's going on? Can you get these folks some answers? They may not always like the answers, but usually we can help them get to the bottom of those issues in a quick time frame. So people should know that we should, whether we're been in there for 2 years or 20 or Republican or Democrat, we can and should play that role. Accountability and oversight. We can talk more about that. I've been on the oversight committee the last 2 years. And then being a voice for folks whose maybe issues or needs or personal quests are not being met. How do you provide a voice for that within the legislative process? Interpreting what the legislature has done for the public. And then what I like to call campaigning. Not campaigning to get elected, but campaigning to organize and develop public support, to build public support behind a goal, whether it's in the community or at the state level. And I guess just one example was what I was able to help with last year in the conservation bond referendum, which unfortunately was narrowly defeated. But using the office directly or indirectly to bring people together to get things done at the community level. So and then the oversight capacity, we're always talking about how can government do better. Especially if you're in the minority, you kind of have to play that loyal, critical observer. It's something I kind of pride myself on, being a former newspaper reporter myself. Telegraph Road Sports Department, 1975, 1977, for those who didn't know, hired by Hal Lagerstrom. But you try to use your powers of observation and then your writing skills to bring maybe some items to the attention through the oversight process that need to be improved upon or fixed. And unfortunately, we've not had a strong formal legislative oversight role. Our committee has rarely met in the last 2 to 4 years. But even still, as individual legislators, you have the ability to say, hey, what's going on here? We need to address this problem or fix it. And that doesn't always become a public issue, a public matter, but it's an important role that we play. And I feel like kind of that old investigative reporter in me gives me a special ability to kind of dig into some of those issues. So there's 8 or 9 different roles of a legislator can and should play that I get gratification out of and feel a sense of accomplishment. And all of those things are important, whether or not you're in the majority or minority.
Sure. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe give us an example of a time where you were able to work across the aisle, work in a bipartisan fashion to get something done that you were happy about in the last couple of years, and maybe something where you were stymied by the Republican control?
I'll answer that first one first. I can think of a really good example. About 3 years ago now, after meeting with the Tri-State Coalition Against Human Trafficking and Slavery, they were meeting down at the hotel, the Grand Harbor Hotel, and Grand Harbor just trained all their employees. The sheriff was there, the police chief, and I was there in the audience. And suddenly they put the microphone in front of me and asked me to speak. And basically what I said off the cuff was, I can see a pathway that the state should basically require any employee using public funds to stay at a hotel or motel, or any public body hosting a meeting or event at a hotel or motel. We should require that the employees of that facility be trained in recognizing human trafficking. And that kind of gives them a leg up on getting the public's business, being part of that effort. Long story short, we introduced that bill. It didn't make it very far the first year, but we got some attention to it from the department. It was almost kind of a no-brainer. But in the meantime, I hooked up, again, that connecting opportunity. We hooked up the advocates in Dubuque with the advocates in Davenport. And between them, they approached Republican Representative Gary Moore in Bettendorf. And the next year, Gary Moore introduced almost the exact same bill. And we helped him get that over the finish line. That became law. and one of the sisters from Dubuque and I went down to the bill signing and stood behind the governor as she did that. And that is now law in the state of Iowa, and it was just implemented this past January 1st. So it's not always a direct pathway that we have to getting things done with the majority party. Sometimes they don't, they get pushback from within their own caucus when it appears they're getting too close to Democrats. So you kind of have to like go behind the curtains and work together and work with your constituents who have that common interest to get it done. That's probably, especially in most recent years, one of our an accomplishment I take pride in, because it's something that folks here in Dubuque asked for. We were able to get it done, and it helped them move their own agenda forward. On the other side of the coin, it's been frustrating over the last 4 years to get the legislature to work with me and others on addressing the opioid epidemic in the state. I worked with the Attorney General to put forward some amendments to our budget that would have allocated some of the opioid settlement dollars to some critical needs that communities have. And instead of working with us on that, the legislature instead basically scooped all the money and created an account and said, we're going to reserve the right to spend that money legislatively, and took all the power of the Attorney General away, who Tom Miller is the person who won those settlements and had been working with the governor and with some executive branch agencies on how to spend that money. And in doing that, they only allocated a small portion of that funding, which unfortunately means over the next 12 months, there's going to be $7 to $8 million burning a hole in our pockets, or sitting in a jewel box somewhere, unspent and unallocated, when it could be put to work to benefit people who really need it in the state of Iowa. So I think the legislature's kind of been AWOL on that issue over the last couple of years. I said that on the floor. It didn't make some other legislators happy, but I think it's a nonpartisan issue, and there shouldn't have been any reason in my mind why Republicans and Democrats couldn't have worked together on that, because the ideas, the 8 or 10 ideas are, we all share an interest in those. And then the other area was on that refugee resettlement. It became pretty clear that the federal funding available to us is not, or to the resettlement agencies is not, it's significant, but it's sunset so quickly that there are a lot of unmet needs before the 6 or 9 months that Afghan or Ukrainian refugees have a chance to sink roots and address their housing issues, their access to jobs, their English as a second language, and other needs. And I think it really cried out for the state of Iowa to think about using maybe some of our own ARPA funds to set aside to supplement for those agencies to do more and to connect those people with our communities. And hey, maybe a lot of them will stay in Iowa if they can sink roots here, and kind of build on that legacy that Robert Ray, established for us many years ago. But disappointingly, could not find any partners on the other side of the aisle actually, there were a couple who came up to me afterwards. I won't mention who their names were, but they say, thank you for bringing that up. It's a really important issue. I've been working with that in my own district. And I said, well, how come you didn't support my amendment then? Again, I think there's just somehow a cultural resistance, and we've kind of siloed ourselves. Republicans don't take Democratic ideas. Democrats tend not to take Republican ideas. And it's something we need to get over soon, I think, because we got a lot of significant problems that we're kind of kicking the can down the road on. Climate is another one that I've been very involved in. Very difficult to get the state to come up with any concerted climate and environmental policy, to look at our natural resources and say, hey, how can we work with communities like Dubuque County, and sustain those going forward?
Well, I do want to talk more about some of the climate issues that I know you've long been a proponent of conservation, water quality, and some of those issues. But jumping back to the refugee resettlement, you mentioned that in terms of being one of those areas where you're able to be a convener between local and state. So where does that, how does that manifest? I guess I haven't seen much in the way of resettlement here in our area, or has that taken place?
Yeah, well, convening and connecting, I identify separately. So it's kind of a connecting role. I'm on the Lantern Center committee for development and marketing, and that group's done a tremendous job in recent years in becoming more visible and building community support. I've encouraged them to kind of maybe spread their wings a little more and have a greater role to play in advocacy beyond that English as a second language education piece. Unfortunately, during the Trump administration, the policies they implemented really hollowed out Iowa's capacity to support refugee resettlement. They required that every agency be able to settle a minimum of 100 people before they could be considered a federal partner. That basically put Catholic Charities out of business in Dubuque. And in the meantime, Catholic Charities is really focused on legal assistance for immigrants as their niche. So one of the discussions we had as part of that conversation about state aid would be, can the state of Iowa allocate some resources so that entities like Catholic Charities could provide that legal assistance to basically indigent people, to help them work through all the paperwork and maybe even show them what the path to permanent residency and citizenship might be. Because the federal regulations about who is a refugee, who is not, and what they can do and what they can't do is not a simple maze to navigate. So that would probably be one area concrete that we've been trying to open some conversation about.
Okay. I didn't catch the very last thing that you sent. I think it was about some green legislation or something. Can you brief us on that?
Yeah, that's every now and then you got to find a reason to live, so to speak, politically. And that kind of falls under the campaigning heading, building public support for something. Several states, including the state of New York in 2021, have adopted state constitutional amendments that basically say people have a right to a clean environment. And that really gives some legal footing or standing to folks who want to advocate for the water, for the land, for the soil, for the wildlife, for people who are, maybe suffering some environmental injustice because of some of those things. And so basically, I'm working with a group that I came in touch with through the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. It's online as forthegenerations.org, but they've been promoting the Green Amendment nationally. Second edition of a book by Maya Van Rossum is coming out in the fall. It'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in Iowa. But she has made this her life mission. And so one of the things I've been doing is wherever I go is talking about it and getting, to start with, conservation environmental groups to think about coming on board. This is kind of a long-term campaign. Nothing's going to happen in a year. It takes 4 or 5 years just to get something on the ballot in Iowa. But ever since we as a legislature have basically turned away from implementing the Iowa Water and Land Legacy Amendment from 2010 and raising sales taxes to fund conservation projects in Iowa, conservation commitments in Iowa, the conservation and environmental movements have become really fractured. The governor, through her proposals and some of the Republican proposals, they managed to drive some wedges between some of those groups who are willing to make compromises, others not willing to make compromises, kind of a little bit of infighting over, if we're going to change the formula for how that money is spent, whose ox should get gored or not get gored. Some people are saying, hey, we haven't been getting any money, so we'll take whatever deal we can get. So I basically said we need something else to bring those communities and groups together around a common cause that they can all see themselves in. And I think a long-term campaign to get a green amendment adopted in Iowa, given some of our climate and clean water and soil health issues, could be something that if we don't ever achieve, it'll still be a way to bring people together and talk about those issues. So one of the reasons I've launched kind of this quote unquote campaign this year is because 2022 is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. So I've said, hey, let's do some, let's meet up and have a toast and talk about how far we've come cleaning up our water since 1972, and also how far we still have to go. And so one of the things I'm encouraging folks to do, anybody who tips a glass at a craft brewery, I'm suggesting that they get their brewery to sponsor a promotion to brew a special beer using clean Iowa water where we can find it. Give it a cute name, do some interesting marketing, maybe sell it at a premium, and we'll use some of those funds to start investing in our effort towards this green amendment in Iowa. So I'm hoping that might catch people's imagination here going into the fall. At one point, as you know, probably know, Dubuque Brewery is in the middle of a major expansion. So they
got to be getting close, actually, I think.
Yeah, they've been getting out, they're preoccupied, but he did agree to do a special brew with us. So hopefully we can get that done before the end of the year and at least get capture the imagination of folks around Dubuque.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about water. It's been clean water's been a long time issue associated with you. Give us your quick rundown on what still needs to be done, or what you've accomplished in that the years of that fight, and what still needs to be done.
Well, I think what we've been able to do with the county's significant commitment and investment in that over the last 2 or 3 years is, I think Dubuque County is showing itself as a leader in kind of flexing our muscles, expanding the scope of what we're trying to do in this neck of the woods. Obviously, we have some unique geography here, being at the end of the Driftless. And we probably have some landowners who are a little more experienced with conservation efforts, soil and water conservation due to that landscape. So I don't take credit for that, but I know I've worked with county supervisors. At one point, we had 3 Democratic supervisors, and I think I said, hey, why don't we do more? And they took up the mantle, and I think that's continued on a bipartisan basis since then. And we got some really good people working in that space. So I guess probably having folks in my district and surrounding areas take all of this more seriously and what's our role to play is probably the most, for me, being kind of like being the change is important. And I think our community is trying to be the change. I think we need to do more in investing, making resources specifically available for watershed management authorities. And I'd like to think I've played a role in helping the Catfish Creek Watershed Management Authority and more recently the Maquoketa River WMA identify things they can do on a watershed scale. And I think to hold up our end of the bargain, the state needs to dedicate some of the resources and funding we are making available specifically so those WMAs can achieve their goals. Because I think the one drawback, even within a voluntary system that we have, which I guess I include myself in that camp, that a purely voluntary approach to water quality will not succeed in the long term. Within that framework, we need to do more to focus our resources on specific watersheds. Because sprinkling the money around all over the state simply within, among willing farmers is not going to move the needle on that in-stream water quality. We need to show that if there are concerted efforts within smaller watersheds with everyone participating, that we can make a difference. Not only how much they contribute to that, those in-stream pollutants, but also how well we can clean up the county and state parks that may have lakes or trout streams within those watersheds. And I think if we take that geographical focus, that we can bring people together and we can make meaningful progress, demonstrate that if we do this more widely, we can make an impact. And I think we're just uniquely capable, given our ability to bring partners together in this part of the state, of kind of leading the way on that. So that's kind of been my approach from the minority and trying to move forward, make progress. And fortunately, I've been appointed now for several years to the state's Watershed Planning Advisory Council. So I've been able to sit down with various stakeholders on an annual basis, encourage them to come forward to us with very vigorous recommendations, and then try to do what I can to make sure that we as a legislature take note of them.
Okay, I gotta let one of my colleagues jump in here. Bob, do you have a question?
I got a few topics. I know in one of your documents that you shared with us in advance, Chuck, you mentioned about the state solar tax credits. Where do those stand now? What was your role in that? Where do you see that going forward?
Well, our goal, most immediately, and I offered, and several other folks offered amendments during the session to basically provide the funding for the state to make good on the commitments to homeowners that put on rooftop solar or solar arrays in their yards, who did so in good faith and did so before the deadline. We only allocated I think eventually it was $7 million a year. And once that cap was reached, everybody had to go on to a waiting list. Well, the program as a whole was sunset at the end of this last calendar year, meaning anybody on that waiting list was sucking eggs. They weren't going to get what they were promised. So we offered amendments eventually in one of the last bills before the session ended. The majority party did include that and appropriated money to pay off those credits to anybody who put the solar on before the end of last year and made their application before the end of June. Unfortunately, we did not renew the program. The federal government, in the most recent legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, extended the solar tax credit program. Iowa has retained a portion of our program for small businesses, but we did not renew the program for homeowners. So at this point, only the federal tax credit is available, and the state supplement is not going forward.
Okay, thank you.
There are a number of things we could be doing in the solar area beyond just tax credits. And one of the bills I'd like to point out I introduced, I think I sent you the whole laundry list of bills that I sponsored. One of them I worked very hard on and was able to introduce toward the end of the session was an incentive program for agrivoltaics. Agrivoltaics is basically putting a solar array on agricultural land, building it in a way that is high enough for agricultural production to continue underneath it. Might not be row crops, shouldn't be row crops, but could be small animal grazing, could be vegetable growing, could be pollinator habitat. And the incentive hopefully would cover the additional cost of building the array in a way that agriculture could continue being underneath. I think that is an innovative way. It's been done in other states. In fact, I just got back from a trip to Colorado, Denver hosted the Natural Conference of State Legislatures. I took an opportunity to go up to Longmont and visited Jack's solar farm, Jack's Solar Garden, where he's done exactly that. And he's got University of Arizona and Colorado State University doing research on how well alternative crops do under the shade and water preservation qualities of a solar array. So I think that's a win-win for renewable energy and agriculture if we can find a way to bootstrap some of those projects.
Allie, you want to jump in? We got to go.
Well, the main thing on my brain right now is waiting for a murder verdict, as happens. I don't know. I guess I would say, I mean, from your perspective, we've talked a lot about, a big thing for you is, around agriculture, clean water, environment. Are there other things that kind of are on your priority list, or things that you would want to continue working towards, outside of some of those areas, or things that you want to see happen?
Well, I did mention the refugee resettlement issue, the opioid issue. I've tried not to be a Bigfoot, so to speak, and come in there and have an opinion on everything under the sun. As many of you know, I've worked a long time before being a legislator with the Dubuque Area Labor Management Council. So certainly working on some of those workforce shortage issues and how our education system can maybe be adapted to connect with communities and addressing that. That's certainly an area of interest. If we could get some traction on cleaning up our election, access to the ballot box, I think we've taken some steps backward there in recent years. And I've always, since I first ran, have been concerned about the role of big money in politics. If there's some things we can do to, if not get that money out of the system, to put some boundaries or guardrails on how that money can be spent, or even if it's accountability in terms of knowing where it's coming from and who's providing it. It could be something as simple as, and we don't do this, believe it or not, requiring identification on robocalls. I know that's the one thing that by the time the end of October rolls around, people are just pulling their hair out. They don't answer the phone anymore because of robocalls. Some people would like to make them illegal. I think if we at least require the folks paying for them to identify themselves, maybe that would, especially maybe some of the more negative things that come out that upset people, we can start reducing that. So those have been long-term interests. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing much interest in the majority, willingness of the majority party to address them. So have not really been as active on them as I have lately. One area I do think there's some opportunity, again, bipartisan, especially when you got a federal government controlled by one party and a state government controlled by a different party. We have had for many years now an Office of State Federal Relations. The state code says it is an independent agency. What it's become, unfortunately, is perceived as the lobbying arm of the governor. And I think there's a much stronger role for that office to play if we want to do some more, in this case, nonpartisan or bipartisan work between federal and state government in addressing the needs of a state like Iowa that may not have all the resources it needs to address those problems themselves. And so I've been looking into that issue and offered a bill to maybe bring that office out of the shadows and maybe provide a more vigorous role in connecting the Iowa legislature with Congress. And I guess another thing I'm really concerned about within that greater umbrella is that, and this kind of is what I did with my Iowa rescue plan, which I sent you a link to, a 5-phase proposal on how to spend American Rescue Plan money. one of the reasons I did that is the legislature is taking no interest in directing the executive branch, the governor, in how to spend that 1.5, close to $1.5 billion the state has received, and have basically abdicated all authority and responsibility to the government and the executive branch agencies to allocate that money. I think there's a legislative role to play, and we haven't taken it. And I think there's more we should be doing. And I think our oversight committee should be the place to do it.
Right. I have to head out, but thanks, Chuck. I appreciate it. Thanks for sitting with us, and wish I could stay a little longer. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Allie.
So Chuck, I have a question that I know it's more of a federal issue, but I'm wondering at a state level what you can do representing our area. And that has to do with the loss of commercial air service in Dubuque. That was a significant setback for our community. We recognize that we have never really been the commercial travel hub for the area, or the leisure travel hub for the area, but the business travel hub, yes. And so the loss of service starting about a month from now is a significant concern, and I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
Well, I should probably develop some thoughts. We're going to have, and I'll be attending a few of the meetings this week with the federal delegations in town to meet with city and county and other elected officials. And maybe that's a conversation we should have. Off the top of my head, I would say, what assets do we have locally that we could, marshal to, get the attention of airlines. As I understand it, that their major issue is workforce. They don't have enough pilots with flying time available to serve smaller markets. One of the things we do have is a very strong aviation program at the University of Dubuque. Maybe we can find a way, and maybe there's a role for the city and Chamber of Commerce and other groups to play in telling airlines, hey, if you're willing to serve Dubuque, we'll give you a preferential pipeline to train pilots coming out of the University of Dubuque. I don't know if that's at all feasible from a licensing standpoint or whatever, but I think we have to get creative about what our assets are and how to deploy them to solve problems like that.
I think a significant concern or issue would be that the federal government provided significant bailout money to the airlines, which is taxpayer money. And so now local taxpayers in our area, as well as others across the country, are seeing service go away. And it doesn't seem like a good use of tax dollar money if we can be abandoned.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know that the federal government put a whole lot of strings on the quote unquote, it really wasn't bailout money. It was bridge money to keep business afloat through the pandemic. And what the expectations were of those businesses coming out of the pandemic. I think that's one reason why we need to have a stronger state-federal relations activity or focus within state government, so that I and similarly positioned legislators and other communities in Iowa can work with and through that office to bring some collective effort, so that it's not one, two, or three communities each trying to act, separately. And then to the extent those communities are in different congressional districts, let's gang up, right? On those, and maybe even work with similarly positioned small communities in surrounding states. That's kind of was what I did for 17 years with the Labor Management Council, try to get strange bedfellows together around common causes. And so certainly trying to be creative and organizing, again, a campaign. That's really what you're talking about, a community-based campaign to get something done. I certainly would be willing to come to that meeting and sit at that table and contribute whatever I can.
In the I'm sorry, Anything else, Mike? In the primary that for your opponent, taxes was a big issue, and she talked about wanting to have further tax reform in the state and some things of that nature. Tell us a little bit about where you stand on, you know, some of the changes we've seen in taxes in the state, and you know, your take on where that should go.
Well, tax reform is, you know, it's a nice label. It's kind of like what's behind that curtain, though, and what do we mean by it? Reform suggests that there are, you know, systemic problems, and I'm not going to deny that there are no systemic problems. But I think what we've seen over the last 10 years, and I've been on the Ways and Means Committee since I began serving, we've seen a systematic effort to fail to fund basic state government services in deference to multiple ways of using quote unquote excess revenue to provide tax cuts to, in many cases, people who don't need it. Corporations, wealthy folks. Most of those tax cuts are predominantly going to folks in higher income brackets. Meanwhile, we have basic government services, including education, suffering. And so I'm not going to go in front of voters and say, you know, we're not taxing you enough, or the tax cuts aren't needed. What I'm going to say is we have an obligation first to fund the basic services that people expect and elect us to provide. And we aren't doing that. And I'll just give you two examples of how we're not doing that affect us very directly. One is, as you know, the Dubuque School Board has proposed to sell the Dubuque soccer complex because they need to bolster their reserves to pay operating expenses. And they closed one school to help do the same thing. And they're talking about merging, you know, a couple middle schools as part of that plan. That's a predicament we put them in as a state legislature by failing to fund them at appropriate levels over the last 10 years. And that especially hurts districts like Dubuque that are seeing declines in enrollment because they lose actual dollars for every student who doesn't enroll. If I'm not mistaken, I'd have to double check this. Dubuque may actually be on the budget guarantee, where we say you're guaranteed a certain level of funding no matter how low your enrollment might go. That's why the school district is saying they need to sell the soccer complex. And it may go to somebody that has no interest in continuing to make that amenity available to the people of Dubuque. You may know that I've been involved on that board until last fall. I've been on that board for 30 years, and I was there at the founding of pretty much all of those soccer organizations that use it. So it's kind of a personal issue for me as a result. But the board will point to, and I will agree, that it's lack of funding at the state level that's forcing them to basically monetize assets to do that. Another area is funding of Department of Natural Resources. And the most glaringly obvious manifestation for the public we're supposed to serve is the planned eviction of rangers, park rangers from state park grounds, which will certainly diminish their visibility in many respects, but also make law enforcement and emergency response a dicey proposition going forward once that's accomplished. I don't know if I could say something kind of more on background at this point because I don't know the answer, but one of my questions is at the Makokata Caves, you know, is the ranger there still living on the grounds, and was he available and able to respond in a prompt manner? The reports are that it was Jackson County Sheriff's first on the scene. I'm not saying that situation would have turned out any differently, but I think those are the situations that we need to be mindful of. If there are people there 24/7 at a campground, personally, I think there needs to be a park ranger on that ground or somebody else filling in for that person on a 24/7 basis. So the reason they're doing that, I get it. We've underfunded Department of Natural Resources. They're scratching for ways to make their budget. They're holding positions vacant. When I was on that budget subcommittee, it was routine that they were keeping over 100 positions vacant and unfilled, and they were basically using that money to backfill benefits and salary increases for everybody else. And now they're saying, well, maybe we can save $1 million by not having to maintain those houses for rangers. I don't think that would have been an option at all if we had been properly funding Department of Natural Resources. So that's my view on taxes.
Got it.
Yeah, let's tax at the proper level, but let's make sure we're funding basic government services first.
Okay. Well, we've covered a fair amount of ground, and I promised these guys we'd wrap up here in 45 minutes or so. Any final things that we didn't get to that you want to make sure to say?
I guess not necessarily in my own behalf. I got your email addresses, and I can forward anything I may have neglected.
Sure.
I just want to thank the Telegraph Herald for its commitment to maintaining a reporter presence at the Capitol, even if it's only on a monthly basis. I think I don't know that it makes our job easier, but it makes it possible for folks in the community to know more about what's going on, and they can bring in some informed questions to us and information to us to the extent you're able to, provide some local coverage of what we're doing down there. It's not very common that local newspapers are sending people down anymore. So I want to thank you for continuing that commitment.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And Ben Fisher's had good luck with all of the folks in our delegation, both sides of the aisle. Really opened his eyes to a lot of issues. So we're happy to be able to do it. Well, thank you for your time, Chuck.
Thank you.
The rest of the way.
Good seeing you all. Next time, maybe in person.
All right, sounds
Yep.
good.
Thanks,
Take
Chuck.
care.
Bye.